Hello, everyone. This is Austin Parker, and I'm going to make a video for my River of Life activity. Um, I don't have any visuals except for my face, so that's okay. But I wanted to do this because uh, I guess I want to practice my speaking a little bit. So I'm just going to go through and talk about what I learned from the module and some of the highlights that I experienced while learning with you guys. Okay, so in the first module, we learned about theories of development. That was a great experience for me as I'd never studied development as an academic subject before. And I really gained a lot from the activity that asked us to relate our understandings of nation states, and citizenships. Um, I learned a lot from the people in my CLG um, as we all came from different contexts and places, such as Japan, China, Suriname, Vietnam, and Jordan. And this also gave me the opportunity to relate my international teaching experience um, with a more theoretical perspective of human development. And it's also been great just to uh, collaborate with people who aren't necessarily teachers or are not necessarily in education, um, which is who I, collaborate with pretty much every day in my professional work life. And the second module was equally as stimulating. I really enjoyed reading about the case of Timor Leste, I think is the way to say it. And I really liked how we got to do a debate, even though it was a written debate, um, about the importance of the medium of instruction in schools. Um, so language policy is something that really interests me as a teacher. I'm an English teacher. I've been an English as a second language teacher in America, in Thailand, and in China. And I've been an English literature teacher in English speaking schools, in Thai speaking schools, and Chinese speaking schools. So yeah, that one felt pretty relatable to me. But it was really nice because I hardly know anything about Timor Leste. So I also really enjoyed learning about some of the just general history of that country. And in the third session, um, I really liked learning about the four Asian tigers in relation to the developmental state thesis. And it seemed that Professor Morris was really knowledgeable about this, and I think he has a lot of great experience, firsthand experience in Hong Kong. And I found it really interesting about um, his argument that those countries in the four Asian tigers, their development was guided by strong central governments and uh, by a relatively equal distribution of economic wealth and uh, economic development. So, and I didn't get to join the webinar, but I watched the recording, and I really liked how he could answer our questions personally. Okay, module 4, that might have been my favorite one. I really liked watching the movie. One thing I really liked about this class is all the different types of activities we got to do, from debates to watching movies to webinars and so on. So I really like this film, Schooling the World. I'm surprised I hadn't seen it because I try to watch a lot of these education-related movies when I get a chance, especially ones that are about international education. Um, so I really like that and how it touched on the negative effects that globalization can have. This one, yeah, really struck a chord with me because um, it brought up a lot of questions that I've had in the back of my mind and the front of my mind as a teacher the past several years, such as what are my responsibilities as an English teacher, as an American teacher in a foreign country, what are my responsibilities as a member of a dominant cultural group in a foreign country, in a developing country, and how can I carry out my responsibilities in a just and ethical way. Um, so yeah, this module and this session brought me back to the concept of globalization, which I hadn't really studied formally since I was an undergrad. Um, and this has really inspired me to look more into the relationship between globalization and education, more in a more uh, academic with a more academic focus. And I'm considering doing something like that as part of my dissertation, and maybe even the paper for this module. So I find those topics especially interesting. Okay, module 5. I didn't I took that one off, but I did enjoy reading everyone else's posts about the PISA test. I'd heard of the PISA test before. I think that's how you say it, PISA. And it seemed that there's definitely some controversy regarding it. Um, so this test examines math, science, and reading in many countries across the world. I think there are countries that belong to the OECD. Um, and it seems that this test can give a measure of an accurate measure of some things, but it might not be the definitive measure. So it seems that there's also an agreement that um, uh, there are other ways to measure academic performance as well. This is just one measure. And I find it interesting that I haven't been teaching that long, but I've taught in 3 different countries, and I've never had any personal experience with the PISA test. I'm waiting until one place I work has, gets asked to take that test. My students get asked to take that test. I find it interesting. Okay, module 6 examined minorities in relation to education and development. So I really liked this activity, another form of sharing our experiences through pictures this time. So I really liked viewing people's pictures and hearing the stories behind them. And then reading about Professor Adamson's research on multilingualism in China, which is something that I have some experience with being a teacher in Beijing. Um, but my personal experience has very little to do with minorities and minority languages. So that was kind of eye-opening and interesting to read about all the research being done in Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang and even in Hong Kong. So yeah, that kind of it gives all of us a picture of how diverse that country really is, and yeah, it definitely gives me some things to keep in mind when I'm doing my daily teaching job and for future research that I might be interested in. And it makes me want to travel around China a lot more. Okay, Module 7 was about lifelong learning, and specifically about lifelong learning in Japan and Singapore. But I think everyone was able to relate it to their own context. And it brought up a lot of questions for me about kind of foundational questions about the contemporary education system. For example, why is education compulsory for kids and then teenagers, and then it just kind of stops at age 16 or age 18 or age 20, and then we go to college. Um, when I look at it from kind of an abstract sort of way, it seems kind of it seems a little bit arbitrary. But I know there are reasons for it, but it also made me ask, why should formal learning end at that point in life? And so that's why this topic of lifelong learning was really interesting, and it reminded me of something that I had read and done some work on from a different module, education module that I took at UCL. And that's from a book called Working Class Writing and Publishing in the Late 20th Century by Tom Wooden. And that was about a group of working class people in England in the 1970s who organized their own writing groups, writing classes, and published their own poetry, sort of as a response to working class prejudice in England at that time. So I thought that was really interesting, especially in comparison to Singapore and Japan. Okay, Module 8 focused on citizenship education in East Asia. So this asked us to critique the video of the Chinese New Year's Gala. So that was really, I found very provocative, and it was really interesting to read everyone's responses and reactions. I also really enjoyed the readings from that module, which gave us insight to citizen education in Asia from a lot of different viewpoints and methodologies. So Morris, Kogan, and Leo's paper gave a comparative analysis of 6 countries in Asia, which gave a nice comprehensive overview of citizenship education in East Asia. And then Jiang and Xu's paper made the arguments about how moral education ought to be carried out and how citizenship education can be focused in a more worldly, cosmopolitan manner. So I thought that was a pretty bold and interesting argument to make. And then the last paper was by Kennedy, Lee, and Zhao, and I thought it was interesting how they took some inspiration from Michel Foucault, and they interviewed students in Beijing about their views of citizenship, and they did this without any real interpretation or generalization of their research findings. So I thought that was a really interesting way of doing research. It just kind of allows you to see a person's viewpoint, a person's opinion, and then the reader can make their own, can draw their own conclusions from it. So that one, all the readings in that module were interesting to me. They had to do with, at least a lot of them, I think 2 of them or 3 of them had to do with China, and especially the last one, which interviewed students. So I'm considering interviewing my students as part of my research for my dissertation, although I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to interview them about yet. Something to do with education, international education, learning abroad, traveling abroad. So that was really beneficial for me. And then Module 9, just last week, allowed us to look at nation building through the case study of Kazakhstan. So that was really interesting too, because I didn't know much about Kazakhstan at all before reading those papers. And I thought that it was really interesting to read about the concepts of civic states and ethnic states, and how the authors O. Bakane and Kevlahan, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, argued that those concepts are never entirely realized. They're kind of like ideals to strive towards. I kind of see them as a spectrum, although I don't know if that's the right way to look at it. But it also kind of made me relate the case of my own home country, the United States, where I'm visiting now. So I see the U.S. as a model that fits the civic nation quite well. It has a constitution. It has documents that say people are equal and have equal rights and can participate in political systems, social life and economic systems equally. And but when this model was developed, it only applied to certain people. It didn't include groups of people such as slaves or women and others. So I just think it's interesting that over the short history of the United States, the civic nation ideal is still not fully realized, just as the authors argue in that paper in the case of Kazakhstan too. But it seems like the U.S. here, it's it's a country that's still kind of striving towards that ideal. So I found that really interesting, and it was really interesting to read other people's context as well. So yeah, this is 15 minutes of talking. I hope that's creative enough. So overall, I really enjoyed the module and the readings, the discussions, the activities. I found them all really intellectually stimulating and challenging. There were times when I found it to be quite demanding, and I struggled to keep up with everything and submit, my best quality writing and work. But looking back on it now, I think it was definitely worth the challenge and the struggle. So at this point, I find myself with a lot of new ideas and inspiration for continuing with my master's at UCL, and I have a lot of new ideas, and I'm getting closer to nailing down a topic for my dissertation. So I'm especially interested in globalization. Shh. No, sit. Sorry about that. So I'm especially interested in the themes of globalization and education, international education, and the idea of cosmopolitanism. I really liked reading about that in, I think it was Jiang and Xu's paper, and how it relates to an Asian context or a Chinese context, because that's where I'm working now. That's where I'm based now. So if anyone wants to discuss more of that, or anyone else is interested in that, you can contact me and I'll try to talk to you. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. It was really nice learning with you. I wish I could have met you in person. The online class is challenging sometimes, but it's definitely, it allows me to travel around the world and still have a great way of learning new things with really smart and interesting people. So thanks to all my classmates and my professors. All the feedback you gave was really detailed, and especially thank you to Layla. Yeah, your feedback and your guiding of the module was very helpful and enthusiastic, so I really appreciate that. So it's been a great experience, and thank you very much.